Greetings and welcome to another edition of Trinity Radio. I'm Johnathan Pritchett, and today we're going to be reviewing a video from Godless Engineer. Godless Engineer recently did a video responding to What Do You Mean, Mike Licona and David Wood. So let's take a look at Godless Engineer and see what he has to say.
Today we're going to be taking a look at What Do You Meme's live stream he did with Mike Licona and David Wood.
Mike Licona actually wrote this book, which you guys have heard me recommend probably on live streams. It's The Resurrection of Jesus, and in this book it's a massive beast, right? And this book is awesome though, because what I really liked about it, if you're looking for like an objective perspective too, on like somebody that's trying to be as unbiased as possible and evaluating like most of the, I guess some of the, you guys direct data. I can't remember how you qualified it, relating to Jesus in the first century. And that book is like, it's the best that I know of as far as that.
Yeah, I want to echo that sentiment. Resurrection and the Son of God from N.T. Wright is also a must-have. It's about as big as this one, but this is if you're interested in apologetics, or if you're interested in critiquing apologetics like Godless Engineer, this book and N.T. Wright's book, Resurrection and the Son of God, are both books that you should read, but John is exactly right. This book is phenomenal.
Oh, I wonder what kind of objective look at the resurrection that a Christian apologist did.
As objective as possible. Didn't say completely objective without any bias. In fact, one of the things that Mike Licona did in this book that I thought was very, very good, and you kind of wish that a lot of New Testament scholars and other people like that would do, is he inserted a section of this book called Confessions, and in that Confessions he lays out his biases, his background, his presuppositions, and things like that, which unfortunately not a lot of people in the field do. This conversation they're having has a context and a fuller treatment in the book they just referenced. So yes, he does lay out all of that. It would be a good thing for more people in the field to do. Unfortunately, not all do that. So props to Mike Licona for setting the standard there with being open and upfront about his biases, his presuppositions, his background, and of course sorting through all of the methodology that he implements in his monumental work.
Considering that Mike Licona is still a Christian, I'm guessing this objective look wasn't so objective.
Absolute rubbish. See, there's a confusion here that if you believe a particular thing, then you can't be objective in your analysis of something. That's like saying Bart Ehrman and all of his conclusions, he's not a Christian. He makes a boatload of money trying to debunk traditional claims about Christianity and about the New Testament and about the Bible. So obviously, Bart Ehrman can't be... No, you don't say that. Just because someone has reached a conclusion that they actually continue to hold, doesn't mean that they're not being as objective as possible, which is what they said, in their work. That's like saying that nobody can be at all objective. No, you can be objective. Bart Ehrman can be objective. He may not be completely objective, but, like Mike Licona, we all know what his biases are and what his presuppositions are. But that's not to say that Bart Ehrman is just carrying the torch like Godless Engineer is just to debunk stuff. Mike Licona didn't say that he was completely unbiased and without any sort of presuppositions or anything. No, he stated them, just as Bart Ehrman does. So props to Bart Ehrman. We all know where Bart Ehrman is coming from. But no, the idea is to be objective, take an objective look at all of the data, is not to say that you have no biases or that you're completely 100% neutral. Neutrality is a myth, and a Godless Engineer knows this. So just because you conclude that Jesus rose from the dead doesn't mean that you're not being objective. Or you could make the same claim that just because you conclude Jesus did not rise from the dead, you're just not being objective. You're not looking at all the evidence. So this kind of stuff is silly nonsense and should do better.
If you're interested in this analysis of Mike Licona's bad historiography, then please...
Bad historiography. Do you have any evidence that what he did was bad historiography? That's what I would like to know. Where is the evidence that he did bad? Do you know what historiography is? How to do history? why is it bad? We don't ever find out anything like concrete about why it's bad.
You know, when Gary Habermas and I were finishing up our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, we were almost done in 2002. And at that time, I remember asking him, I said, Doc, why is it you've got this bibliography, which I think it had 22 or 2,400 sources. Now it's about 3,500, maybe even more. 2,400 sources at that point written by scholars.
Well, there was a little banner that said, is not a peer-reviewed. Well, actually, it was, this particular book was Mike Lacona's dissertation that was expanded into a book. So in that sense, he probably had several people on his dissertation committee review it. So, and you got to pass that. And then, of course, when you get something published by an academic publisher, in this case, IVP academic, not Kriegel. And then, of course, Mike's latest book, Why Are the Differences of the Gospel? That's, of course, published by Oxford Press. So it's not like slouchy academic publishers are just peddling this stuff. No. It went through a thorough review process. So try again.
From 1975 up until that present day, which again was around, I think it was 2002.
Exactly how many books have been written on the resurrection that say the exact same? Sure, they could solely analyze on one particular portion of the resurrection or of Jesus in general, but it seems like all of these guys have their own particular book that argues the exact same arguments for the
no, actually they don't. Number one, they don't all conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. Two, not every source in there is a book about the resurrection, which you would know if you had at least read the bibliography. It's a big book. But no, they're not all books about the resurrection. Every source that he cited is not books about the resurrection. A lot of it is historical Jesus studies in general that touch on the resurrection, but of course it's a wider field than that. But they're not just a bunch of Christian scholars saying, Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, there's I don't know, only the bibliography of like books written by Christian apologists that specifically deal with the resurrection is not a massive thousands of entries bibliography. It's less than that. But there are peer-reviewed journal articles and other books that either touch on the resurrection, deal with the resurrection directly, or just general historiography books, books on just historical Jesus, and all sorts of books like that that may interact with the material of the resurrection insofar as they relate to the historical Jesus. It's a huge field, and I don't think that it's dominated by confessional Christians either. It depends on where you go. So if you're at like Evangelical Theological Society, yeah, the New Testament scholars there are going to all be pro-resurrection and affirm it. But if you go to something like the Society of Biblical Literature or other places like that, you're not going to find that same kind of consensus that you would find at something like the Evangelical Theological Society. So you may think that, because it's a field dealing with the Bible or the New Testament or even the Old Testament, it must be dominated by people who believe in Christianity.
resurrection. Also, just because you found a lot of people that agree with your conclusion does not mean that your conclusion is correct. This is just an ad populum fallacy because he's sitting there like, well, all of these people agree with my conclusion, therefore I'm well supported and I am correct. No, you're not.
Yeah, but hang on for a second. Just because people agree with the position doesn't mean that your position is correct. I agree with that, but he's not talking about agreeing with his position that Jesus rose from the dead. What he's basically talking about, if you read the book, he's talking about the consensus of New Testament scholars that agree with what Mike Lacona calls the bedrock facts. These scholars include people like Bart Ehrman, Gerd Luderman, Paula Fredrickson, Robert Funk, Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, people who don't necessarily affirm that Jesus rose from the dead, but they do agree to some degree or another with the facts that Mike Licona uses to make his argument for the resurrection. But that's what he's talking about, certain conclusions that deal with his case that, Jesus actually existed, which is something I don't think Godless engineer. He says he's a mythicist, which is, I mean, come on. Really? But you and Price and Carrier, man. Come on. But anyway, Paul's conversion, things like that, that Jesus' death by Pontius Pilate. Facts that historians, Christian or not, within the field of New Testament studies, and yes, there is an aspect of New Testament studies that qualifies you as a historian. New Testament studies isn't just people who read the New Testament over and 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 over again. New Testament studies involves history, okay? Because number one, it's a document from antiquity, which means it's an old document, which means you also have to study the history surrounding it. So even in seminary, where you study New Testament studies, you get a whole lot of history, not just church history, but Greco-Roman history, ancient Semitic history, all kinds of history. Now, not all aspects of New Testament studies touches on history, but a good chunk of it does, and Mike Licona knows what he's talking about. So while we're on that subject, this book is the big book about the resurrection, but I wanted to show you that this portion of it is just on methodology. It's a primer for historiography, right? And it's this section that's just on how to do history is as big as this book that's all about historiography, right? Historiography, books on historiography. These are all books that people who like the New Testament have to read on historiography. Look at all these books, historiography, and look how thick they are. And look how thick this whole book is, but yet this section of it is like these books on how to do history. So it's not like when you're in seminary, you don't read a lot of books on not just what happened in history, but you also read a whole lot of books on how to do history. And I'm sure Mike Licona has read an infinite amount of more books on the subject than I have, just judging by his bibliography that has a lot of entries by historians who are writing on the subject of historiography. Okay.
Type of argument reminds me of the apologetic about how the Bible's been copied and transcribed so many times in history, and how we have so many thousands of copies of the Bible that inherently makes the Bible true. I don't really care how many copies something has or how important the book is to one particular group or another. It doesn't speak to the truth of what's in the book.
You know what's interesting is that I've never heard a single apologist make that claim. So I don't know if it's his inability to listen or his inability to understand arguments, but the Bible, what is said about Scripture is that it is the most well-attested set of documents from antiquity. We have more copies of it than we do all other ancient documents comparable to this time period, like Homer, Plato, whatever, Xenophon, Aristotle. We just have more attestation of documents, more ancient copies of it than we have of other things, which helps textual critics come to see the integrity of the text better than other ancient documents. It's not saying that, we have a bunch of ancient manuscript copies of the New Testament, therefore it's true. That's a claim that no one's ever made. So I don't know what you're talking about. But the claim is, and it's right, is that we can have more assurance of the reliability of the transmission the more documents that we actually have. It's a strength of the text of Scripture that we can have so much manuscript copies to examine to understand that. Now, from there, most historians believe facts about history as recorded in ancient documents far less attested than the New Testament. Okay? So what New Testament apologists and Christian apologists are saying is that the reliability question, we know basically what the text said. Even Bart Ehrman, after he goes on and on about 100,000 errors in the Bible, is like, yeah, I mean, the New Testament, basically what was written is what we got. To 95 to 98 degree accuracy of probably what the originals look like. Even though we don't have the originals, it's basically probably what that is. Nobody's sitting there just doing massive edit jobs. Okay, so put that out of your head. But are those documents reliable? Well, they seem to be generally reliable, as or more reliable than a lot of documents from antiquity that, unless you're just an infinite skeptic about everything that happened in the past, you can come to this reliable. Even non-Christians believe that it is reliable on some things, just not reliable for miracle claims or whatever, because of a presupposed worldview that miracles can't happen. But that's a bias. That's not an actual statement about it. But nobody's claiming that the Bible's true because we have a ton of copies of it. So I don't know where he got that from, but it's an argument that he is refuting, that he came up with himself. So we call that straw man.
Licona goes on to discuss his conversation with Gary Habermas about the current state of New Testament studies.
And he said, well, you've got a few philosophers, but most are New Testament scholars. And I thought, well, are there any professional historians, general historians, who, they're trained in how to do historical investigations? Are there any who have done, an investigation of the resurrection? He said, yeah, there's a handful, but they're journal articles and very small books. But nobody's done an exhaustive one. So I thought, wow, I'd like to do that.
For one thing, Mike Licona is not a historian.
For one thing, Mike Licona is as much of a historian as anyone who does history on a particular time period of history. So you don't need to have the word history in your degree title in order to be counted as a historian. Okay, history is studying the past. Okay, finding out what happened in the past. Okay, that's what it is. And if you are, as a professional paid person, trying to find out something that happened in the past, you're a historian. Not having the word historian in your, or history, like church history or, classical history or whatever, World War II history, whatever, just because the word doesn't need to be in your degree in order to be counted as somebody who's doing history, which makes somebody a historian.
Has a bachelor's in music performance.
Right, and if that's all he had and he was investigating history, he would be doing history, which would make him a historian. Okay?
Specializing in the saxophone, a master.
That's awesome, by the way. Mike Licona played the sax. That's pretty cool. I wonder if it was tenor, baritone, or alto. I, by the way, played the trumpet.
Master's in religious studies, which he got at Liberty University.
Yes, and people who do general religious studies, not just Christian studies or New Testament studies or biblical studies or whatever, but people who do religious studies, okay, they do history a lot of the times. They have to do history stuff, like read a lot of books that I showed you on not just history, but how to do history. Basic religious studies majors, classical studies majors, like people who studied the classics like Homer, they have to do, other Greco-Roman literature. They have to do the history stuff too. Okay.
And a PhD in New Testament studies.
Which involves lots of history, especially if your dissertation focus that you're spending 7 years doing, if you're doing history, you're getting a good, solid understanding of how to do historiography.
I'm not sure if he started off going for a general history degree, but he definitely did not end up in a general history degree. Where he actually ended up was the that is New Testament studies. As recalled by Licona, Gary Habermas states that the current field of New Testament studies is filled with people that are not general historians. They are definitely not taking a look at the evidence objectively, and they are not applying the same historical methods that are used in other fields of history. One of the most common things I face...
Actually, that's wrong. No, he is the reason why you look at you look at philosophers of history more so than whatever, like somebody who gets a master's degree in history, okay? That's a generalist, okay? Now, if they go on to get a PhD in some sort of historical studies, they may specialize in a particular thing, because that's what PhD candidates do. They specialize in some aspect of history, or they may do philosophy of history or whatever. But when he was talking about general historians, he was talking about historians who are generalists, not necessarily specialists in something like just World War II, or just ancient Mediterranean history, or just ancient Near Eastern history, or just Civil War history. Talking about generalists in a field, okay? That's what he was looking for. And when you're a generalist in a field, a general historian, okay, even if your doctoral work is general history, you're going to know a lot of it about a little bit. You're going to know a little bit about a lot of it. But if you're specializing in a particular subject like New Testament studies, you're going to know a lot of it about a little bit, which means that little window of history that you're studying, probably between the Second Temple period on through like the 2nd century AD. You're going to know a lot of stuff about the history of that time, and you're going to study a lot about how historians do the history of that time, which is what we call historiography. So, yeah, but he was asking about general historians, generalists, not people who specifically focus on one thing, but people who are either philosophers of history or just generalists in history broadly.
With my position as a mythicist is how many teaching historians support my particular ideas or positions.
None. That should also tell you something. I know that you don't like consensus unless it's the consensus is something that you believe in, then all of a sudden you wave the flag of consensus, but here, because you have a minority position, you want to throw out consensus. Consensus doesn't mean anything, because yes, a lot of people who don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that don't believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, don't believe that Jesus died for anyone's sins, believe that Jesus actually existed. And yeah, there's a very good reason. It's not because, oh man, you've got to believe in Jesus in order to teach at secular liberal universities. No, you've got to not be a mythicist, okay? Because Jesus mythicist, it's weird. It's like, Caesar mythicists and Plato mythicists. Okay, these people never existed, right? But yeah, we're just not interested in that kind of thing. There's a reason why no teaching people at any universities anywhere hold that position.
It's kind of hard to have anybody in the New Testament studies field back up what you're saying as a mythicist when the entire field is primarily made up of people that have to believe in a resurrection and
false. It's a big world. It's just a big, even just the Western world, okay? But who's making Bart Ehrman believe in a resurrection? Okay, who's making him do that? Okay, who's making Gerd Ludermann? Who made all the Jesus seminar scholars believe in a bodily resurrection, even though most of them did not? But I'm just saying, with all due respect, Godless Engineer, you're just wrong. Depends on, if you're talking about a particular group of New Testament scholars who are Christians, yeah, Christian New Testament scholarship is filled with Christians, but that's different than just our evangelical New Testament scholarship is filled with evangelicals, okay? But that doesn't mean that the field of biblical studies in general or New Testament studies is just filled with Christians. Not at all, okay? So, do some more research.
Have to believe in a historical Jesus as part of their deeply held religious belief. And oftentimes it's mandated by the institutions that they are teaching at.
If they are Christians, yes. If they are not Christians, no. And guess what? I don't imagine that Bart Ehrman is required to believe in a bodily resurrection since he argues against it for his position.
If you want to be honest, the state of New Testament studies is a big jerk of Christians.
Really? So John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman and Jewish people like Paula Fredrickson, they all believe in the resurrection now, I guess, because Godless Engineer thinks so. Come on, man. You know better than this.
I've been plagued with doubts over the years, and I thought, well, I want to do an investigation. I entered this with the objective of proving the resurrection of Jesus, so I know I already have my biases, right?
And that's where you fucked up, Mike. Yeah. You see, you came to the investigation looking to prove your hypothesis. That's
okay, so?
That's not how you should investigate your hypothesis. You see,
no, you can if you want to. I mean, it's like, okay, I have this hypothesis. I want to see if it works. If it doesn't work, then you get rid of it and you come up with a new one. But if it does work and is what you wanted to work in the first place, so what?
using that, you only find things that support your idea. Anything that
Really? So when he read all those New Testament scholars that aren't Christians that apparently Godless Engineer doesn't know that exist, all he was doing was reading other people who agreed with him. No. Look how thick this bibliography is. Let's look. Let's look at how thick this thing is. Just the bibliography is longer than a lot of people's books. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Bibliography goes from 642 to 695. 642 to 697. I'm sorry. 642 to 697. That's pretty thick bibliography. And yeah, it's not just quoting a bunch of Christians. But you'd know that if you knew who he was quoting and had read the book.
could possibly disprove your idea is either not going to be considered or is just going to be pushed to the side as if it doesn't matter. This is because you're only looking for things that confirm your current position.
By reading all those people that do not agree with your current position. Now, again, let's make a distinction. The consensus does agree with some of the things that he states are shared facts that all New Testament scholars and historians or whatever agree with, you know, things about the disciples at least believe they thought they saw the risen Jesus. That Christians, non-Christians can agree with that. That Paul was and James were not friendly to Christianity and then became Christians later, especially Paul was a persecutor of the church. Okay, that's something that people agree on whether they're Christians or not. Unlike Mythicists here, him and Richard Carey are locking arms. The overwhelming number of non-Christians and Christians alike believe that, you know, Jesus was a real person. Things like and was killed under Pontius Pilate, crucified on a cross. These are the things that the consensus agrees with. Now, how they shake those facts out, Mike Licona read a whole bunch and cited a whole bunch of people. And then in this last section of the book, okay, this last section of the book is evaluating people who don't agree necessarily. I mean, Dale Allison's kind of iffy, but the other four approaches that he analyzes, he looks at who does he look at? The hypothesis of people he disagrees with and compares his hypothesis to theirs using sound historiography and using traditional methodology that all historians use, or not all, but some. Okay, he looks at John Dominic Crossan, Gerd Luderman, Michael Golder. He looks at Peter Crafford, Giza Vermes. So he's looking at all of these people. Yeah, it was an appendix that he did Dale Allison. So Dale Allison's in the appendix. So the other 5 people are people who don't actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And then in the appendix, Dale Allison's kind of more on our side, but he kind of leans into the altered states of consciousness kind of stuff. So a little bit different there. So he reviews 6 different people that don't necessarily agree with how he does it and sees how his hypothesis stacks up compared to theirs in dealing with the facts related to the case for the resurrection. So no, you just, again, you're not understanding how all this works.
When you test your hypothesis, you want to try to find things that will disprove it. This is because you can have a lot of evidence to support your hypothesis, but it only takes one piece of evidence to disprove your hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to do an objective investigation and prove that God exists or prove that he doesn't exist. Well, you've already shown your biases rather than just seeking to see, does God exist or did Jesus rise from the dead? And so I realized that I had my own biases and they certainly threatened the integrity of my investigation.
I'm glad that you recognize this, Mike, but ultimately you let your Christian bias poison your investigation.
How do you know that? Have you read his book? Okay. Have you seen the kind of material that he interacted with? No, unlike a lot of these non-Christian historical New Testament studies people that write about the resurrection, who talk about Jesus and they don't tell Christians that, I don't believe a word of this. Mike Licona actually goes through his biases and his presuppositions, and he has whole sections on how anyone, whether you're Godless Engineer or Johnathan Pritchett or Mike Licona, how historians can go about minimizing their biases. He lays it all out in that book, and who you got to check yourself against and who you collaborate with in order to minimize your biases and keep them in check, which is why he collaborated with non-Christians, which you can read about in the acknowledgments and in the section on methodology. So, read.
Yes, we all do have our own biases.
Right. So what? That doesn't mean you can't look at something and have controls for how you go about your investigation, even if you believe something. Okay?
But that's why peer review exists, and that's also why you try to find things that will break your hypothesis.
Which is exactly what Mike Licona did in this enormous book with an enormous bibliography filled with all the stuff that we just, it's already covered. Now, you still don't have to agree with his conclusions, which it helps to at least familiarize yourself with the contents of the book if you're going to critique them while they're talking about his process and that went into writing the book that John McCrae of What Do You Mean was waving around and commending to everybody from IVP Academic Press.
Instead of trying to confirm your hypothesis. If it can be broken, then you need to rework your hypothesis so that it can actually explain everything that it's supposed to. A good hypothesis will hold up to scrutiny. Mike continues on to talk about how this investigation really made him struggle with his faith. Luckily, he had his Christian apologist friends to tether him to the Christian dogma, which ultimately poisons his conclusion.
How do you know that? Just because he concluded that there was a resurrection, all of a sudden it's poison because a Christian looked into it. Now, you know what? We've already talked about this earlier in the video, but this is just absolutely silly. So every time that Godless Engineer, if he were to examine and consider this book, we know that no, he's not. If he looks into the resurrection, he's programmed and predisposed to reject it, is poison everything. That's why even his response video to Mike Licona is poisoned because of his pre-commitment to atheism. So you shouldn't listen to anything Godless Engineer says because he's just biased. He's not objectively analyzing anything to do with the resurrection or probably any religious claims. Why? Because he's got an axe to grind. See, saying things like that doesn't mean that you're right or wrong. And because it doesn't mean that you're right or wrong, we don't need to go into all of that. Because it's actually fallacious. It's actually a non sequitur to say, because he already was a Christian, therefore his hypothesis is poisoned. And his method is poisoned. No, that doesn't follow. This is a non sequitur. So it's fallacious. So if you care about making arguments that are rational and reasonable, don't make that one. That if you believe something and you investigate something and your belief is confirmed, therefore it's false, that's a non sequitur. It could be true and he was justified in believing it in the first place. That's possible.
I was really struggling with this and I wanted to do an investigation to say, hey, if we applied strictly controlled historical method, what would an investigation of Jesus' resurrection look like? And I could live with it if historical investigation turned up, inconclusive. But I couldn't remain a Christian if historical investigation pointed away from Jesus' resurrection. So yeah, it took a while, but it was heart-wrenching. It was one of the toughest things I've done in my life, but very rewarding.
I'm sure that it was really hard for you, Mike. And it really does seem like you got close to taking off those Christian-colored lenses and taking an actual objective look at the evidence. But you managed to retain your bias and actually lean harder into it as you were investigating the case for the resurrection.
That just says how good the case is, man. That's all that means. Or it means that as much as it means anything else is about to come out of your mouth.
As we will see, his Christian bias infects his arguments and investigation.
His non-Christian bias infects all this gibberish he's spewing all over YouTube, right? That's just rhetoric, okay? It's just rhetoric. Doesn't mean anything.
So much, it causes him to say things that no historian would say. It causes him to apply criteria that is only seen in New Testament studies. He stays...
No, the criteria, right? Explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, illumination, it's in the book. It's in all those books I just tossed behind me. It's in a lot of books about how to do history, okay? Which he cites a lot of books on how historians do history, and come to find out when you read about that, there's actually not a whole lot of consensus on how to do history among even the general historians, right? Historiography is pretty contested. A lot of that has to do with postmodernism and some other things, but just how to do history itself is a complicated matter, but what they can agree on, he covers, and he implements those criteria, right? Just like the Jesus Seminar came up with their own criteria, and they use little colored beads and stuff. But yeah, I mean, you lay out your method, and he uses standard methodology for doing historiography, so you'd know that. It's not something that only New Testament studies use. He goes in this first big chunk that I was referring to earlier on method. It's mostly citing philosophers of history and things like that on how to actually do history.
Firmly planted in his Christian dogma the entire investigation.
One of the things
if you're a Christian, you can't do science. If you're a Christian, you can't do history. If you're a Christian, you can't do... Come on, dude, that's silly. That's like saying if you're an atheist, you can't critique the New Testament because you're atheist. You can't do it because you're biased against it, right? You can't be objective, so we can't accept anything that you say. That's all we're hearing, Godless Engineer, and it's pretty silly.
Quick comment on because I missed it when you guys were mentioning this book. If you guys watch my debate on the resurrection with John Loftus, where even atheists were saying I schooled him, this was the main resource I used for my study on this. So good stuff here.
It is good stuff.
My study on this. So good stuff here.
Oh, so we have it being used in action, do we? Well, what do these purely objective arguments look like?
You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances, but a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If my friend Paul here takes a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to him, the rest of us aren't going to ask for his pot of gold because we're not going to see him. It's only in Paul's mind. The leprechaun doesn't exist outside of his mind. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings are willing to die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. The disciples saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had been dead, alive again, standing in front of them, telling them why he had to die and rise again. Unfortunately for our atheist friends, the only sort of thing that can do that is Jesus actually appearing to them, which means that Jesus rose from the dead.
So it's pretty much the same bad historiography and bad arguments that's found in every supposed historical look at the case for the resurrection.
Actually, but no, in standard discussions around the resurrection, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, whatever, some of the agreed upon facts are that the disciples at least believed they saw the risen Jesus. Now, whether they did or not, people debate. But both sides agree that they had experiences of the risen Jesus, whatever those experiences were. One theory put forth to explain that piece of data that everybody, Christians and not, agree on is this idea of group hallucinations, which has been thoroughly debunked. Okay? And then David Wood also puts up another thing that about martyrs willing to die for things they believe are true. That's true of even the people who flew planes in the World Trade Center. They at least believed it was true. Not that many people are willing to be martyred for something that they know to be a lie. It's one of those things they agree on. And so David Wood was pointing out that typically people die for something they believe to be true, not for something they know to be a lie. That's all he's saying. Dealing with things that everyone agrees with. And when those who put the alternative hypothesis to the resurrection, like group hallucinations, to explain the fact that everyone agrees on that they believed they had experiences of the risen Jesus, he's shooting that down because it's dumb. Okay? That's all that's happening here. If you knew anything about this discussion between Christians and non-Christians, scholars all, who agree on a lot of things surrounding the historical Jesus and the resurrection case, even the ones who don't agree with the resurrection agree with certain things, and now you got to explain the data, which in this big old book, like I already mentioned before, in the last section of it, he goes through 5, and then Dale Allison's in the appendix, so 6 different competing hypotheses as to what happened regarding those facts that all those non-Christians that he engaged with agree with, how they explain those facts, okay? And does that compare to the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead? As David Wood was saying in that book, no. The only thing that can explain all of these different things from history, all of these minimal facts sometimes is called, that everyone agrees on, Christians and not, is that Jesus rose from the dead. And it's so compelling. It's so compelling that a lot of atheists and a lot of people do not present competing hypotheses for explanations of those facts that everyone already agrees with because they got tired of getting blown out of the water on them. Just so you know.
Figures. Hallucinations are far more likely than a Jewish man rising from the dead and only appearing to a select number of people that have already had contact with this idea of a Messiah, as well as knowing what other people looked like in general.
No, so a phenomenon of this idea of group hallucination was a phenomenon that does not really exist, okay, that doesn't happen, is more likely than a resurrection. Even if you don't believe in a resurrection, you're going to believe on the same grounds that group hallucinations don't happen, right? And it was groups as large as 500 people, okay, saw this. They weren't all hallucinating the same thing. That doesn't happen in reality. Now, you may say resurrections don't happen in reality either. That's fine, okay? That's your position. But how do you explain that data? You can't just say that I think this impossible phenomenon, even by my own standards, if we're going by like science, is, which I don't know how resurrections offset science or anything like that, but just assuming the kind of stuff that they say because they don't understand reality. Yeah, that's not any more likely, except because you want it to be. That's your criteria. I want this to be more likely, so therefore it is. Okay, that's not a very good argument.
In the clip, Wood acts like these hallucinations can't have some kind of general theme to them, and this is directly contrary to what we see in reality now. We see themes being applied to hallucinations all the time. UFO abductees, they generally relay similar information, and you can even subdivide those particular experiences up into different versions of the same experience.
Yes, but there's a difference between them all sharing the same theme, like, oh, I thought I saw Jesus, and some other guys said, oh, I thought I saw Jesus, and some other guys saying, oh, I thought I saw Jesus. Oh, we all saw the same person and had a similar experience that shared this same theme with this person. No, we're talking about appearing to groups. Okay, it's regardless of whatever you think, what they can't be having is shared hallucinations. So even if they revolve around the same theme, if they're happening in the same company, that's not an explanation because they're not each individually hallucinating. Okay, that's far more implausible than Jesus rising from the dead to account for that one of several facts that have to be accounted for regarding the agreed upon facts of all sides, all parties. Okay, so just because they all have a similar theme, oh, Jesus rose from the dead, they can't all be having the same hallucination, okay, and at the same time. Okay, when Jesus appeared to multiple groups and multiple peoples.
Also, when you hear about people having an experience of an angel or these near-death experiences that are most likely hallucinations, those also take on similar general themes. This is what religion does to a historian when they start investigating their own faith.
No, again, the beliefs of the historian can color their work. That's true for every historian, regardless of their beliefs. It doesn't follow that their conclusions must be false because they have beliefs, right? That's like me saying, Godless engineer, everything he's saying is false simply because he has his worldview. And that means because he believes what because he believes that there are no God or gods and that naturalism is true or whatever his worldview is, we can't accept anything he says about religious matters because his beliefs can't tolerate it, so he has to default against it because he can't be objective, right? No, couldn't possibly matter. What you're saying could be right even if you have a bias, okay? What Mike Licona is arguing could be right even if he has a bias. Utterly irrelevant. But one thing that Mike Licona did, it goes through his process of how to check your biases and limit your biases and control your biases. Who's doing that for you, Godless engineer? One wonders.
It causes them to have ad hoc statements that are not supported by the evidence.
One thing
Wrong. He's commenting on the evidence that's mutually agreed upon by all parties. And one of the criteria that he uses, that historiographers use, is something that's less ad hoc. Now, it can have, even if it has some ad hoc component to it, that's fine. What you want is the hypothesis that is less ad hoc, right? What's more ad hoc is this hallucinations business, because you have all of these different pieces of data, right? The conversions, the appearances, the empty tomb, all these little pieces of data, right? Now, what you're doing is you are saying, for this reason, for this one particular thing, we're going to insert hallucinations for this, right? To explain this one piece. Now we have 4 or 5 other things that we need to come up with, and so we're going to come up with another explanation for this, and then another explanation for this, and another explanation for this, and guess what you have? You have a completely ad hoc explanation for why something like the resurrection didn't happen, right? Whereas the resurrection case, that Jesus actually rose from the dead, is the less ad hoc position because it covers all of the facts better by miles. Okay? So when we talk about ad hoc, what you want is a hypothesis that's less ad hoc that can account for more of the facts, right? What Godless engineer doing is coming up with an explanation for one fact for that. That's exactly what ad hoc is. And to try to deal with all the other facts, he's going to have to, and avoid the resurrection, which handles all of the facts, he's going to have to start invoking ad hoc explanations for all of them. And that's one of 5 or 6 criteria that makes all of these cases that Dr. Licona analyzes in his book, all the competing hypotheses, as part of why, small part of why, but one part of why they all fail.
Really did enjoy about Mike's book, probably my favorite part about the book, is his section on the way history is done. It's called like historical epistemology. If you're familiar with that term, it's just kind of how we come to know things. And in that book, he has like a pretty good section on the different methodologies and stuff that historians take and why it's important to have these criteria so that way we can look past our biases as well. And so I think that's one thing that a lot of people aren't really familiar with. And because of that, they may not understand like I want to say the quality of the evidence, or they don't know how to kind of organize the evidence when it comes to historical evidence and the resurrection. So
it's not that we don't know how to organize the evidence. The criteria that you present here are meant to circumvent this bias that skeptical people have when they start taking a look at your faith. The criteria actually reinforce the bias that you have. Like I said before, this criteria that they use is only ever used in New Testament studies.
Again, he's making the same claim he made earlier. We already addressed it earlier. No, when he's talking about the criteria, he's talking about methodology, things like explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc illumination. That's the stuff that comes in the primer on how to do historiography, from which he pulled from historians. Now, again, Mike Licona acknowledges not all historians agree. In fact, there's a lot of debates in that, but of what they can agree, these tools are generally reliable tools for doing historiography. It's good methodology to be able to come up with these kinds of hypotheses that are solid on explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, and provide illumination and other things like that. So,
to prove that Jesus resurrected and to prove that he existed. And the only thing they're looking to circumvent is your ability to critically take a look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
What about your inability to critically take a look at the evidence? It's just back to the same old nonsense. Just saying it a bunch of times, you can turn the tables around, say you're unqualified Godless engineer, and not simply because you don't understand New Testament studies or who actually participates in New Testament studies or historiography in general, but you're not qualified to talk about anything religious at all because you're biased against it. And you can't critically evaluate anything. See, that doesn't do anything. Saying things like this doesn't matter, right? Because if it's true for him, it's true for you.
Jesus. Next is a really good example of their criteria putting on these Christ-colored glasses for you.
Let's first start about, what do you think about miracles? Can history show miracles or prove miracles? What is your kind of position on that, and what do you think?
Yeah, I do think they can.
Okay, and there we go. That's it. So,
okay, that's not criteria. That's not an issue of criteria. What they're talking about now is, can historians evaluate miracle claims? And good news. I agree with Mike Licona that you can. A lot of people will say no. A lot of other people will say yes. In fact, there are actually Christians who will say no, and there are non-Christians who can say, yeah, I mean, we can. It may not turn out that any of them actually happen, but you can investigate it, right? So he's got about 68 pages on whether or not historians can evaluate miracle claims. Some say yes, some say no. Mike Licona says yes. He's among the Christians who say yes, and among some of the non-Christians who say, yeah, I mean, sure, we can investigate it. It may not have happened. Some say just by default, as a matter of discipline, no. But turns out those arguments are terrible, and I think Licona does a good job siding with the scholars who think that you can in those 70 pages, which Godless Engineer hopefully will read one day.
Yeah, I do think historians can investigate, and in principle they could prove miracle claims. And when I say prove, I'm using prove in a relative sense. I mean, none of us can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusion. So when I say prove, I'm talking about reasonable certainty, of course.
Mike Licona hides behind the fact that you can't 100% prove that a miracle happened in history.
That's not hiding. That's stating what's obvious, which you are trying to be snotty about, but actually agree with.
Let alone anything else in history. He recontextualizes miracles to make it seem like they're just any other event that has happened in history.
No, he's not saying they are any other event that happened in history. The whole point about can you investigate miracles is because they're not like anything else that happens in history. Okay. Deep breath. I wanted to say something to point out something else, but I'm not going to. Come on, man.
This reference class does not actually describe the case of miracles. Miracles would be violations of the natural order of reality, whether a God exists or not.
Sort of. But again, you should read his book. Sometimes they are complete violations. Sometimes they are just a super feat of something natural that occurs. Maybe it has to do with the timing or the scale or something like that, to constitute as a miracle. It doesn't. Of course, all all miracles typically involve some sort of manipulation of physical phenomenon. So whether that's a resurrection or even the miracle of creation ex nihilo is bringing physical phenomenon into existence, or, a curiously timed act of God, which is a phrase used for, hurricanes or earthquakes or whatever. But, manipulation of whatever it is that Jesus does and to heal the lame and the blind and so forth is manipulating physical phenomenon. So it could just be a super feat of physical manipulation or an outright violation, but it's not necessarily an outright violation, because there is something to say. Well, at some point it's unexplained, but it could be explained later, right? We can explain earthquakes, right? But still, there's some sort of, like in the Bible, there's some curiously timed judgments where the earth swallows the people up, like the rebellion of Korah, for example, right? So there's all kinds of different, even just within the Bible, there's all different types of miracles, but they don't all necessarily involve violations of nature, but some do, some don't.
Reference class of other events that follow this natural order of reality does not fit miracles. He has to do this in order for his points to make sense.
But again, that's wrong. What he's saying is miracles are in a special class. Now, can we examine this special class historically or not? Some Christians and non-Christians, most Christians and some non-Christians, I'll say that, say yes. And some non-Christians say yes, and some non-Christians say no, you can't. As a discipline, historians can't do that. A lot of different views out there, my friend. But the question is, these things that aren't like everything else, can we look at those too from a historical perspective? And Mike Licona sides with those who say, yes, you can. Now, that doesn't mean that by examining to see if something happened means that it did happen, but the question is, can you examine miracle claims in the past as a function of doing history? Okay? We clear on that? I don't think Godless Engineer is clear on that, but I want everyone else to be clear on that.
This is the same kind of tactic that creationists use to make their arguments seem plausible. Creationists have to argue against uniformitarianism in order to make their point, and that's exactly what Mike Licona is doing here.
Actually, a lot of people outside of the answers in Genesis don't do that at all, but okay.
There is no historical evidence because here's the thing is, like, you'll see a lot of atheists who will say, like, oh, it's in the history. They kind of throw out history in whole, well, we weren't there 2,000 years ago. There was a comment earlier that said that. Well, how am I supposed to believe something that happened 2,000 years ago?
Well, can't you apply that to Caesar's crossing the Rubicon?
Yeah.
In 49 BC, or his assassination at the Ides of March, 44 BC.
Yeah.
Of course, you can prove some things of the past with reasonable certainty. You can't with 100% certainty, because there's all kinds of challenges to learning about the past.
Here, Licona is using the vagueness of history to hide his historical evidence for his faith. History can be pretty vague, and the historical evidence...
Where was he doing that? He was just sitting there. He was simply saying, regardless of the historical claim, in fact, he goes into this in his book. And you find it in all those other books that I showed, and then all the books that I don't have that Licona's probably read. Most all of them say, conclusions are to be held tentatively, provisionally, but you can have reasonable certainty unless there are reasons to come to a different conclusion, right? That's all he's saying. He's not using that to hide behind anything, right? He's just saying that's how it is because that's how it is.
Evidence for some events in history is not as abundant as we would like. That is the only place where Lycona's evidence has any validity.
Actually, no, again, wrong. In fact, there's better evidence that Jesus rose from the dead than evidence that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. There just is. There's better evidence and more agreed upon evidence surrounding the origins of Christianity, we'll say, and that at least people thought Jesus rose from the dead, than there is for Caesar. But just want to put that out there.
It goes on to basically describe historiography and how we analyze sources. Like, who records an event, when did they record it, who were their sources, and if they are independent or not.
Yeah, basic criteria. Basic questions that any historian would ask of any source of any kind of variety at all. He goes on to talk about standard stuff in the field, and yes, okay.
Then he says this.
You look at sources, and then you look at what can we mine from those sources, come up with what we call facts that we can believe with reasonable certainty. And then you formulate hypotheses to say what hypotheses can account for these facts. And then you assess those hypotheses to see which one best accounts for those facts.
All of this that he just said is subjective.
All of what he said is standard, okay? All of what he said is just basic methodology for doing history. It's subjective in one sense, it's objective in method, but it's subjective in the sense of, okay, I think this is reliable. I don't think this is reliable. I think this is reliable. Okay, but what is reliable? Well, it's subjective to a whole bunch of people. When he's talking about the facts, he's talking about the facts that all the Christians and non-Christians both alike all agree on. These are the facts. That's what he's talking about. Those things that all these people who don't believe Jesus rose from the dead that he interacted with, they agree with, okay? So if his subjective understanding of those facts, and you saw him do the air quote, because, I mean, he's just saying these are the bedrock ideas, the facts that are all agreed upon. We can mine those sources for that. And look at all this consensus out there of people who believe nothing that I believe, who believe Jesus rose from the dead about as much as Godless Engineer does, but yet they agree with those facts. Godless Engineer probably doesn't agree with any of them because he's a mythicist. The overwhelming majority of scholarship, they all are like, yeah, okay, those are those kind of facts. That's what he's talking about, those minimal bedrock facts, which you take those and you form a hypothesis. You take these facts that are subjective, yet the scholarly consensus of Christians and non-Christians all agree with them, okay? So it's about as good as you can get, that everyone agrees. And then you form your hypothesis to account for those facts. And his hypothesis is the resurrection hypothesis, which turned out to have better explanatory scope, power, plausibility. It was less ad hoc and greater illumination than all these competing hypotheses, which once again is why so many critics of the resurrection stopped bringing them, because they crumble every time up when held up to scrutiny.
At the heart of the historical method, it's very subjective as to what you think explains the facts.
Which is why you see what the consensus is, and guess what? If the consensus agrees with you about what those facts are, then yeah, you're in good company.
To Lycona, God existing and Jesus rising from the dead explains all of the facts.
No, that was his hypothesis, but that's not what he was counting. He wasn't saying that. You made it sound like Jesus rose from the dead and God existing was a fact. No, that was part of his hypothesis that seems to do better with the facts than competing hypotheses.
It does explain those facts, but we have yet to prove that God exists and that somebody can rise from the dead in the manner that Jesus did.
Oh, wait a minute. But if that's the hypothesis, you don't need to understand the mechanism, right? You don't need to understand how God raised from the dead. But if Jesus rose from the dead, you can look for the best candidate of how that would happen. And part of the resurrection case is that God is the best candidate. Now, some Christian apologists do the one-step approach. They say resurrection gets you God. Some people do the two-step approach. The William Lane Craigs of the world say God exists, and because God exists, raising Jesus from the dead is not really terribly difficult. So it depends on your methodology there, right? But I mean, of course God exists, right? Of course God exists. I can't believe we're still debating that. I mean, atheists, they don't believe that God exists, but I mean, of course God exists. There's no good reasons to be an atheist whatsoever. I've yet to hear any, and I've been in apologetics for, I don't know, 20 years now. And so I give them a fair shake, and I've been giving atheists a fair shake, far too fair of a shake for 20 years now, listening to them. And yeah, you know, I just not buying it. So yeah, if God's existence, which has been amply demonstrated, and God raising Jesus from the dead is a better hypothesis to account for the facts than anything else, then that's the one that you should go with if facts matter. And a hypothesis that has not yet been refuted. Resurrection, I call it a historical fact.
Occam's razor says that a hypothesis among competing hypotheses that has the least amount of ad hoc assumptions attached to it is most likely the correct one. The two assumptions that...
Yeah, you just don't multiply, right? You don't multiply your entities for your explanation beyond what is absolutely necessary. But, again, he's got this backwards. God raising Jesus from the dead is simple. This ad hoc explanation, hallucinations, explains the appearances. This ad hoc explains the disciples stole the body. The Romans buried the body in a field of dogs, right? That explains that one. And then Paul was having a midlife crisis. That explains that one, right? That's more ad hoc. All the hypotheses other than the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that God raised Jesus from the dead, are the more ad hoc.
Icona and all other apologists have to make in this particular context are...
Wrong. All atheists make more ad hoc explanations in trying to respond to the resurrection case. It's less ad hoc to believe that God exists and raised Jesus from the dead.
Ad hoc, unfounded assumptions. Next time, we're going to...
Naturalism and atheism are ad hoc, unfounded assumptions, by the way. Okay? Your position does not get... Atheism and metaphysical naturalism, or even methodological naturalism, as far as I'm concerned, is not privileged to have the default status of being unbiased and objective, blah, blah, blah. You have not earned that position of privilege for methodological or metaphysical naturalism or atheism. Gives you no privilege or standing in any conversation whatsoever. Your biases and your presuppositions, which you have, which are equal to any Christians, gives none of us have any standing of privilege over facts, okay? So don't make that mistake, right? Because Christians, we don't buy into the myth of neutrality. And it sounded like Godless Engineer was willing to admit earlier that he doesn't buy into it, that he knows that he has his. But don't think for a second that yours are more privileged, right?
We're going to take a look at Michael Icona and how he argues for the resurrection of Jesus. A couple of arguments get brought up, and he tries to circumvent them in ways that might surprise you. So tune in next time for that particular analysis. For now...
That will be fun. Anyway, this has been a response video from Johnathan Pritchett here on Trinity Radio. Be sure and check out our sister podcast on the Trinity Commission, Bible Brodown with Matt Chisholm and Billy Winland, Soteriology 101 with Leighton Flowers, and The Narrow Path with Steve Gregg. Thank you for your attention. If you want more content like this, be sure and like and subscribe. Like the video, subscribe to our channel, and if you'd like to support more video content like this, please go to patreon.com/Trinity Radio and become a patron. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. Y'all be blessed.